Okay. Thank you, Ganglo. And our last but not least speaker is Nadav Knaan, a PhD candidate in the law faculty in Haifa University. I invite Nadav to give his lecture regarding the traditional property system of the Southeastern Indians during the 17th and the 18th centuries. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. So the subject of my research in this presentation is the traditional property system of the Southeastern Indians or Native Americans, the ones in North America, not the ones from India, during the 17th and 18th centuries. This includes several nations. I usually focus on the Cherokees, but there are other nations and tribes as well, like the Chickasaws and the Creeks and several others. And these used to live in the southeastern parts of North America in the southern Appalachian Mountains. They all shared rather similar characteristics and a similar way of life. This involved small settlements or villages, small towns of about a couple of hundreds inhabitants in each one, and rather egalitarian society without real classes, without ruling classes. Everything was rather equal. No professional specializations, and the economy was subsistent, was very basic. It was based on real small-scale agriculture in the fields around the villages, and some hunting done by the men, and gathering, which was done by the women. So it was a combination of hunter-gatherers and an agricultural society. Now, these native societies were obviously oral-based or pre-literate. They were once called before the age of political correctness. Now it's called oral-based, and this basically means that they had no writings. And this has two outcomes on my research and any other research. The first is that the fact that the Indians themselves did not have any, did not record their own history. They did not have their own sources describing their own way of life. So it is vital to turn into other sources, and these sources are European descriptions left by all sorts of European travelers or merchants, traders, diplomats, missionaries, and just explorers and adventurers that used to live among these tribes, among these communities, in these villages, sometimes for really lengthy periods of time, sometimes 20 years or more. They spoke the local language. They knew the local customs, and it was a really popular genre at that time to describe exotic or these exotic cultures. And we can turn into these sources in order to learn more about these societies. So this is the first outcome of the lack of writing. A second outcome is that unlike our sort of legal culture, when we have two layers, we have the layer of the formal law, right, all these books and case law and laws and constitutions, and we have daily life. So in these native societies, we don't have the formal aspect of law. We only have the second one, which is daily life. So we have to look at these descriptions of daily life in order to look at them and try to figure out what were the norms or the behavioral patterns and rules concerning property, which is my subject. Okay, so getting more into the subject matter, it's possible to divide the study into several property objects. And there are six property objects, the first one being the agricultural fields around the villages, the second being houses, the third being movable items like weapons or tools. The fourth is knowledge, immaterial property, knowledge in medicine and formulas, things like that. The fifth is all these village square, like public sites, village square and the village playground. Each village has like a team. They played a lot of sports. And the sixth is humans. The sixth and the last one is humans, because humans were also regarded as property objects in these societies. They were regarded as slaves, or some humans, of course. Regarding each of these property objects, we can ask two main questions. The first one is, who were the property subjects? That is, who were the social units who could own the property objects? And this kind of question can tell us a lot about the society, because after all, property is a very important form of power. So if we know which social units held the property, we can know more about the division of power inside the given society. And we can ask, for example, was ownership more private or more public? Was it held by individuals? Was it held by families? Was it held by men? Was it held by women? Was it held by individuals or families? And so on. And we can see that the answer actually varies according to the property object. Some objects, for example, knowledge and movable items, those were individually owned by individuals. But others, such as the agricultural fields, those were owned by the families, not by any individual, by extended families, by households. And other items like the village yard or the village playground were obviously owned by the entire village, the entire community. So this means that the property system included several types of owners, and it was quite diverse. So this is the first question that we can ask. And the second question relates to the meaning of ownership, the nature of ownership. What was ownership? Now this is obviously a very fundamental question in the theory of property and law. There are a lot of definitions and ideas. But we can say, it's safe to say, I think, that any ownership involves a certain degree of control. Control is a vital element in any sort of ownership. But what kind of control? We can probably divide control into three subcategories. The first subcategory being the subcategory of possession and use. It's the very basic meaning of ownership, the ability to use the object. The second subcategory is the sort of negative right to prevent others from using, to exclude others from using my object. And the third subcategory is the ability to transfer the object either by selling or by giving away your object to other owners. So if we can examine these various property objects using this model of three subcategories, we can again see that the answer about the nature of ownership, what is ownership, changes and varies according to the property objects. In some objects, again in knowledge and slaves, humans as well, the ownership was very strong, and it included all three subcategories. The owners were able to use them, possess them, and they were able also to prevent others from using them, and they were able to transfer them to others. So this is a very large scope of ownership, which is pretty much resembles the one that we know in our Western culture. But other objects, for example, houses, the ownership was much more minimal, and it only included actually the first subcategory, the subcategory of possession and use, because the owners, which were the families owned the houses. They could not really prevent others from using them because it was socially acceptable, socially required, more correct to say, to share your house with other people, with other families. So these houses were not excluded. And houses were also not transferred to others. It was simply not something that was sold or bought. So only the first subcategory existed. And we can see that here the ownership was much more minimal. The nature of ownership was much weaker. So we can see once again that the property system was not one-dimensional, and that the nature of ownership depended on the property object. It's also interesting to note, if we look at both the questions, if we look at both the answers to the two questions, that there's a certain link between individual ownership and a strong sense, a strong extent of ownership. There is a certain link. Now I'd like to talk about another sort of issue that also relates to the native time perception and its effect on the native property system. Now the native time perception was very different than the linear time perception that we know in our Western world. Here, I mean in the modern world, we see time. The metaphor of time that we usually have is something like a line that stretches back from the past, from the distant past, through the present, into the future. We think of time as something that is measurable. We measure time all the time. We have all these units. We have seconds, minutes, 15 minutes, hours, and so on. And we are really controlled by time. We're slaves of time. Everything is under schedule. And time is something, again, that is measurable, and it's a separate element. Another perception of time is a cyclical or circular perception of time. This is very common in agricultural societies, like the circle of the year, the seasons of the year, the circle of life. But the most dominant perception of time in these native societies was a time perspective that is called event-related. And this perception does not see time as something that is a separate element. It is not measurable. And it only happens if things happen. And if nothing happens, then there's no time. Now, this is a bit difficult for us Westerners to understand, but it also has echoes in our life. For example, if we're in a very boring situation where nothing happens, then what do we say? We're saying that time doesn't pass, right? This is our subjective feeling, even though obviously the clock keeps on ticking. But we feel that it doesn't. And it's also important to notice that the linear time perception that I mentioned before, it's very much future-oriented. We keep on planning ahead, while the event-related time perception is much more rooted in the present conditions. So what does all of this have to do with law, with property? What kind of rules or norms would we see in a society which is very much present-oriented and doesn't see time as a separate element, as a separate factor? I'll give three short examples. The first one, perhaps to state the obvious, is the fact that there aren't any rules that are time-specific, as opposed to our legal culture, when we have all these laws of limitations or obviously procedural rules. We have to hand in things in 30 days or 7 years, no matter what. These were not existent in these native societies. Time was not a factor. There was no time. So obviously all the laws, all the norms did not involve time. And more interestingly, perhaps consequentially, time itself was not an element that could affect and determine the legal status of objects and of rights. If we look at what we know, for example, in the Bible, we have the law of the Hebrew slave. He was set free after 7 years. The mere passage of time, 7 years, after 7 years, he was set free. The factor here was the time. And in these native societies, there were also slaves, and they were set free, but not as a result of time, because there was no time, but from other results, other reasons, mainly because of changing conditions in the present, but not from anything that related to time. So this was the first example. Another example is the fact that the legal action was always executed in the present, in the immediate present or in the immediate future, as opposed to our legal culture, when there's often a time gap between the legal obligation and the legal action. Like I can sign a contract, but the actual moving into the apartment can be done in a much later period. So this did not happen. We can see in a lot of examples, for example, when a person died in the native societies, his possessions were immediately divided, almost immediately. And there was no time gap between the legal action and the understanding, between the legal understanding and its implementation. So this is the second example. And the third example relates to the fact that there was no concept of abstract ownership. Ownership was always involved, like we saw in the first model, always involved with possession. There was no ownership that was unrelated to possession. And this, of course, is very much different than the ownership that we know in our culture, when I can be a registered owner. I can have an apartment. It's registered on my name. I don't have to use it. It can be empty. But I do have the option in the future to use it. And this did not happen in these native societies, because ownership was always related, connected to possession. And this is requiring the owner to keep possessing or using his object. This kind of ownership is much more connected to the present condition. It's actually a reflection. It's actually a reflection of present condition, while the abstract type of ownership is sort of above present conditions, and it allows the owner options for the future as well. So that's about it. Just in conclusion, I must say that these societies are obviously lived in a very simple and basic way of life, but their property system seems to be quite complex. It was not one-dimensional. It included several types of owners, and the ownership itself changed according to the property object. And I think that although these societies are very different than us, and we can still learn about a lot from them about our own legal culture and our concepts. Thank you.